Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, committee. House Bill 2238 would direct legislative administrative services to be responsible for the preparation of legislative committee minutes. Under current law, legislative research is responsible for preparing those interim committee minutes. This would now make legislative administrative services the agency that is responsible for all interim committee minutes in addition to session minutes. So Section 1 just amends KSA 461210. That's relating to the duties of the Legislative Research Department. That would strike that requirement to prepare interim committee minutes. Section 2 amends KSA 461212A. That concerns duties of legislative administrative services and would add language then to require them to prepare those interim committee minutes. The bill is effective upon publication of statute book, July 1, 2025. There was a technical amendment in the House Committee on Legislative Modernization. There was an A that was in the incorrect spot on page 2, line 17. So this moved that placement of A and then passed 2238. The House passed 2238 by a vote of 123 to 0. I can stay for any questions.
Well, thank you. Questions, committee? Seeing none. Thank you, David. First up on the list is Shirley Morrow, Director of Kansas Legislative Research. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. It's good to be here. As David explained, this is just moving the processing of interim committee minutes from legislative research to legislative administrative services. Legislative administrative services hires committee assistants, trains the committee assistants to do the minutes, are responsible for the minutes, and this will just make everything more streamlined, more consistent, efficient, to have all of the minutes prepared in legislative administrative services.
I like the way you worked efficient in there. Thank you. We'll get to questions here afterwards. Next on our list is Thomas Day, Director of LAS.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Tom Day, Director of Legislative Administrative Services. My only part in this is to be support of Legislative Research Department and make this bill part of the statutory language so that, as Ms. Morrow said, it'll make everything more consistent through the entire year, not just through the legislative session or the interim sessions. So it just makes everything more consistent. Mr. Chairman, I will stand for questions if there are any.
Okay, thank you. Questions, committee? Soldier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Tom, for being here. This isn't directly tied to it, but something I want to put on your radar when you mentioned streamlining. Some of the requests I've had coming in from constituents is that there be a streamlined process for submitting of testimony, because it seems like there's a lot of differences between committees in terms of the time frame, those types of things. So I'm not expecting an answer, but just kind of want to put that on the radar because, like I said, kind of indirectly related here to streamlining.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? I would kind of ditto what the ranking member said. I get a lot of complaints from, and I realize this is not your direct department, but when people want to bring in testimony and all like that, every committee's got a different rule. And it's tough to kind of keep up with, so it'd be nice to kind of standardize that. So we appreciate it. Any further questions? Thank you very much. And folks, we'll close the hearing on 2238, and we'll move to House Bill 2240. And with that, David, do you have a rundown for us?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. House Bill 2240, this may look kind of familiar that, we had, this committee heard Senate Bill 161, which was similar, but that was all public assistance programs. This 2240 is requiring legislative approval for any Medicaid state plan amendment, demonstration, or waiver. that expands coverage or increases costs to the state. So this is just only speaking to the medical assistance program or Medicaid. The bill would enact a new section of law to prohibit state agencies from seeking or implementing a Medicaid state plan amendment, state demonstration, or waiver that would expand coverage to additional classes of individuals or increase costs to the state unless the legislature expressly consents to the action. The provision of this section will not apply to any state plan amendment or waiver that is currently being implemented on the effective date of this legislation or July 1, 2025. The House Committee on Welfare Reform did amend House Bill 2240 to then also require legislative approval for any changes to funding structures, day services, or targeted case management services for persons with intellectual or developmental disabilities. A similar amendment was put on Senate Bill 161 in this committee. The House Committee also added language to provide that when the legislature is not in session, a state agency may request approval from the Legislative Coordinating Council to make those Medicaid state plan changes or amendments or demonstrations, waivers, or change those funding structures for those IDD individuals. The legislature, the LCC may approve or refuse an agency's request or designate a standing committee or special committee to review the agency's request and then make recommendations to the LCC based on that committee's review. The House did pass HB 2240 by a vote of 89 to 34, and I can stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Questions for the reviser? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just clarification, what was the Senate bill number that was similar to this? Do you know?
161.
Thank you.
Seeing no further questions, thank you, David.
Thank you.
In our list of proponents, we have quite a few proponents and opponents, and so we're going to limit testimony to about 2.5 minutes each. Connie's going to keep time, and that'll give plenty of time for questions afterwards for both groups. And on your written testimony, if you have your agenda, Lori Feldkamp is written only. So we'll begin with Brian Schema. Oh, he's on WebEx. Okay.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Brian Sikma. I'm a visiting fellow at Opportunity Solutions Project, where I study workforce and public welfare issues. Just wanted to stand today in support of House Bill 2240. This bill is a very common sense measure designed to ensure that major policy changes in Kansas Medicaid programs and other programs receive direct legislative approval before they take effect. And the reason behind this is pretty simple. Legislators are elected by the people. Voters don't elect bureaucrats and they don't elect cabinet secretaries. And so when there's a major change to the funding structure or to the administration of a public welfare program, that should receive the approval of the legislature. Medicaid is one of the largest expenditures in the Kansas state budget, as it is in many state budgets. And the state plan amendment process has been used to make massive change, legislative consent or input into the process, and that's deeply concerning. A prime example of this is the Kansas Continuous Eligibility Waiver, which Governor Laura Kelly's administration unilaterally implemented in 2022. This waiver keeps able-bodied adults, in other words, individuals who are healthy and are able to work a job, on Medicaid for a full 12 months, even if their income increases and they no longer meet statutory requirements for Medicaid eligibility. The state's own Medicaid data shows that unwinding of continuous eligibility during the public health emergency was able to find that 44% of enrollees undergoing redeterminations were not approved for renewal. Even using a conservative estimate, this would mean that more than 41,000 Medicaid enrollees per month would remain on the program despite no longer qualifying due to the specific waiver that the administration sought. This will end up costing Kansas taxpayers between $4 and $10 million a year, with the higher figure being a far more realistic estimate. This policy was never debated. It was never approved by the legislature, and it was granted through executive action. It committed millions of Kansas tax dollars in additional Medicaid spending without a single vote. And the bill before you today, House Bill 2240, will ensure that never happens again. And Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to stand for any questions you or the committee may have.
Very good. You got it done in about 2 minutes. We will save questions for the end. Are you able to stay with us?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we will save questions for the end. Next on the list is Rachel Banning. Is Rachel on WebEx too? She's written only also. Okay, thank you. Next on the list then is Jim Huber.
Chair and committee, thank you for allowing me to be here. I'm a parent of a 50-year-old developmentally disabled individual. I've been involved with services for over 30 years. Thank you for the smile, Senator. I know my own senator very well, thank you. And I'm here, and I've shortened a bit, given our limit. I'm here because this is something I consider of an utmost necessity for my own developmentally disabled child, for his peers, and many of whom I've come to know over the years, and for whom I have a great affection, and for the providers of services for them, for whom I also have come to great respect for their dedication, their knowledge and expertise, and honestly, their affection for those to whom they provide vital support. I ask simply that you support the passage of this bill. It contains a needed charge which requires that changes in the Kansas IDD system be reviewed and approved by the legislature before they're implemented. Our legislators represent us and the provider community who support us. Presence of this legislation has in recent weeks brought about an opening of collaboration between representatives of the providers and of we who are recipients of the supports with the Kansas Department of Aging and Disability Services that had previously not existed to that extent that is now existing. In my experience, thorough planning and the use of expertise from those actually implementing policy and those living it daily results in efficiency in the introduction of change and in maximizing the beneficial aspects of the changes. Continuation of this collaboration and meaningful dialogue among all of the parties is absolutely essential, and the requirement for it is for it to continue must be supported and protected by this legislative action. I therefore again ask for your support of HB 2240. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and we'll do questions at the end.
I'll be about the curb until midnight if anybody wants to.
Okay. Thank you. Is Lori Feldkamp here? I was told it's written only. Okay, Lori, come on up. Welcome to committee.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. I apologize in advance for my voice. I woke up this morning with this. So I will be brief, as my voice only allows me to be. So I stand here in support of House Bill 2240. For many of the same reasons that the gentleman before me spoke, but I will also speak, especially in consideration of what this committee is about, which is efficiency. There are a number of things that are going forward that KDATS has proposed that I think have a great potential of costing the state of Kansas more money and providers more money going forward. I'm not opposed to the ideas that KDADS is proposing regarding the changes in our assessment process, the changes in unbundling of day services, and also making sure we're in compliance with federal regulations regarding conflict of interest. But I do think that providers and people served and parents and guardians need to be an active role in that, and we are just getting started on that process. And going forward, I believe that the legislature needs to have oversight to make sure that everyone's voices are heard and those ideas are implemented and not just given lip service going forward. I also say this with respect for KDADS. I really do respect the people who work, and I know that they have good intentions, and I also know they have deadlines. But just last night, I received an email from KDADS. It was an email blast announcing a grant opportunity for unbundling of services, and that kind of disturbs me a little bit when we're still in the planning process to get to a point where we can really work on such a grant, and that has already been released, and we have to apply for it by April 14th. So given that, I think it's important that we have this oversight that is allowed for by this bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lori, and we'll hold for questions once again. Matt Fletcher with Interhab. Welcome, Matt.
Chair Murphy and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to express support for House Bill 2240, which addresses the concerns of families and professionals who came before you originally on February 11th to express support for this bill's companion, Senate Bill 161. At that time, you heard from several families and professionals who expressed widespread concerns regarding substantive changes that KDAD's intended to make to the IDD service system here in Kansas. And we appreciate this committee's support of Senate Bill 161, and we appreciate your consideration of its companion, 2240, today. Those two bills were amended by this committee and the House Welfare Reform Committee to include language that would address the concerns of those families and professionals that you have heard from since the beginning of this session. Thousands of families in particular have reached out to their legislators to express those concerns. We are relieved to share that subsequent to the amending of Senate Bill 161 and 2240, we did see KDADs express a desire to sit down with the community, and they have engaged in a work group process that we are committed in participating in. We have dozens of InterHab member organizations that are now participating in those work groups, and InterHab has brought consulting resources to bear to assist in this process as well. However, the underlying concern that brought us to this committee a month ago still remains. Significant changes which can affect the lives of thousands of our most vulnerable Kansans can be made without meaningful input from those who are most impacted. Proposals for complex change can arrive at the doorstep of families and professionals in a fully formed state without proper vetting from those vital communities. Accountability and transparency can be faded into haze when critical stakeholders are talked to instead of partnered with. And for that reason, I encourage your continued support of the language that's now included in House Bill 2240, and I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Rachel Newman with COF Training Services. Welcome to committee.
Thank you. Honorable Chair, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My name is Rachel Newman. I've spent much of my career advocating for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, both as a caregiver for my sister and an executive in the field. I'm here to also express support, as my colleagues have, with this language that we've added in, or that has been amended into the bill. Thoughtful, inclusive policymaking is critical, yet providers and individuals are often forced to navigate abrupt, impractical changes without meaningful engagement. I want to express and acknowledge appreciation to KDADS, who recently has displayed some engagement and willingness to work with provider stakeholder groups. Unfortunately, providers still lack assurance that our input will be truly considered and reflected in changes made to the system. For years, we've raised concerns, offered solutions, only to see major changes develop behind closed doors, forcing us into a reactive position when unintended consequences arise. While much of our concern is based on historical action, there are also recent actions that reinforce this concern. KDAD's members recently noted that this bill is not necessary as they've agreed to work with providers on some of these proposed changes. However, they have simultaneously moved forward on other changes, again, without engaging with providers. A recent example of this is final rule training mandate that came out in February 19th. Federal regulations require that providers provide final settings rule training, which was released in 2014. While this is yet another unfunded mandate to our system, we understand this expectation and have complied. COF's trained on this final rule since 2014 when it was released, and in June of 2024, COF worked with KDAD's members to revise our training to make sure it was adequately addressing everything they wanted. We used the training outline they provided and adjusted our training, investing over $7,000 in revision and implementation of this training. Then in February of 2025, despite this collaboration, KDADS released a different training that was then required, which would add an additional $4,000 annual cost to providers that completely disregarded all of the work we had done. Beyond the fiscal barriers to this training, there were accessibility concerns for our staff and individuals that were not considered. While KDADS was very responsive in pulling back this training after we raised concerns, again, it reinforces that there is still not a commitment to change for change from this reactionary implementation process, which is certainly not efficient for anyone, any of us. At the center of this discussion is a core principle in our field: nothing about us without us. Just as providers, we would never impose major life decisions on individuals we serve without their input. Policy changes affecting our system should not be made without genuine stakeholder engagement. I want to be clear that providers are not resistant to change. We have embraced meaningful progress time and time again. For change to be efficient and effective, the system changes need to be strategic, informed, and structured, not rushed and reactionary. From our perspective, this bill does not prevent progress, ensures progress is achievable, sustainable, and beneficial for those who depend on their services. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Questions for the proponents committee? My goodness. Seeing none, I would call your attention to, there are a number of written proponents, and take a look at those when you get a chance. We will begin now with opponent testimony, and we have Sean Gatewood on behalf of CanCare. Welcome to committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My testimony will be brief. Very similar to the companion bill. I have more sort of mechanical type questions about this bill. You know, what constitutes an overrun versus what the estimates are. So what would be, you know, definitively, what would constitute something sort of going an expansive program? So the bill seems pretty vague about that. Is a dollar that? I'm not certain. I'm not certain what the penalty would be. I'm also not certain. This seems to be sort of a solution in search of a problem, because I'm not aware of any you know, expansive government program through a state plan amendment, SPA, that kind of thing, unilaterally without legislative authority. I think the example given earlier will probably be addressed by other proponents that know more, or opponents that know more about the intricacies of what goes on at KDHE and KDADS than what I do. But I will be here to answer questions at the appropriate time, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Sean. Heather Bryan with Kansas Action for Children. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. I am Heather Brahm, Senior Policy Advisor with Kansas Action for Children. We are weighing in opposition to House Bill 2240, as nearly 61% of CanCare members are children. While we understand some of the complications around specific to the IDD waiver, we want to pull back and talk about the entire medical assistance program. And then also, before I begin my testimony, I do want to address what was said by one of the proponents about parents, and I know KDHE can further address this later, but the adults he was talking about are parents of children who are below the 38% of the federal poverty level. These are parents that make, for a household of 3, I'm doing this off the top of my head, so don't hold me to this dollar amount, but I believe their household income is about $12,000 a year. So these are extremely low-income parents of children that he was talking about. That policy has been in place since 2010, not 22, and it was put into the waiver in 2021. KDHE can speak a lot more to that about how all that happened, but it has actually been state policy since 2010. So the medical assistance program goes through a number of changes throughout the year, responding to congressional action, federal government changes, human consensus caseload changes, and changing healthcare needs. Some of these program changes are time sensitive. If the process to pursue changes can only occur with legislative authorization, the medical assistance program will no longer be able to quickly pivot a complex program when the federal government releases new rules and mandatory changes, or the state needs to pivot in a crisis situation. We urge this committee to instead find middle ground solutions to navigate both ongoing legislative oversight of the program without micromanaging an already extremely complex program, including exploring making the human consensus caseloads process more transparent and adding additional legislative oversight in other ways. Changes to the medical assistance program with large price tags already go through the appropriations process, but some changes do occur through that human consensus caseloads process, which remains extremely opaque to both lawmakers and advocates alike. Another alternative could be to add to the Bethel Committee's meeting count and statute to allow additional legislative oversight, meeting time to discuss issues, and even subcommittees to learn more about the complex program that serves our most vulnerable Kansans, including pregnant women, low-income children, people living with disabilities, and the elderly. For all these reasons and more, we ask you to oppose this bill. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Perfect timing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Marissa Alcantar with Alliance for Healthy Kansas. Welcome to committee. Did I get the last name right?
Alcantar.
Alcantar, okay.
It's tough, I understand.
Tomato.
Thank you for asking. Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. I'm so excited to be here with you on this lovely March morning. My name is Marissa Alcantar, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Specialist for the Alliance for Healthy Kansas, and I'm here to speak in opposition of House Bill 2240. In terms of the bill, I bring a couple of concerns. This bill will create extra steps for Kansas and limit the state's ability to respond to opportunities and changes in our Medicaid program. It will ultimately prevent timeliness and efficiency in our response time to any potential changes to our program as well. And requiring more out of our approval process to keep us in compliance with new regulations could very well create a backlog for the legislature and LCC, which is not something that we want to have happen here in our state. Ultimately, this is going to slow down our process for Medicaid, and we don't want this to happen because our program is such an important source of health coverage for so many Kansans. It's helped so many of our Kansas families. The Kansas legislature already has oversight for the program. Two of these are the agency budget process and the Bob Bethel Oversight Committee. This House bill can and will slow down the system of Medicaid, and this will cause it to be less responsive and less effective over time. All of this is going to harm the individuals on the Medicaid program that is intended to serve. I respectfully request your opposition to House Bill 2240, and I will stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Sarah Hartware with Kansas Council on Developmental Disabilities.
Good morning.
Welcome to committee.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony in opposition of HB 2240. My name is Whit Downing, and I'm here not only as a KCDD employee, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the challenges that Kansans with IDD face every day. For a little bit of background, I was on the IDD waitlist for 8 years. I spent 8 years of struggling and not knowing when or even if help would come. 8 years of having to wait, even though my needs did not go away. Instead of getting the services that I desperately needed to live a safe and independent life, I survived a suicide attempt, was in and out of the mental hospital, and I had one crisis after the other. KCDD opposes this bill as it poses risks to the future of home and community-based services system in Kansas, specifically for our IDD community. Sarah and I are going to outline a few key points. First, we already have the Bob Bethel Joint Committee that oversees the implementation of HCBS waivers and meets regularly. I have personally given testimony at this joint legislative committee, and I have seen how other self-advocates, families, and organizations actively participate in these meetings to bring concerns/support to legislators. We don't need to add more layers of bureaucracy, which slows down progress. Secondly, Kansas will delay forward progress on eliminating our IDD waitlist. With a current waitlist of approximately 4,300 and an average waiting time of 8 to 10 years for the IDD waiver, individuals and their families cannot afford another delay. Because of each of you, we've made significant investments in the last 2 sessions in allocating new funding to reduce the IDD waitlist. Any additional legislative approval will create significant delays in responding to compliance issues, service enhancements, funding, as well as the launch of the new community supports waiver, which is a critical component of eliminating our IDD waitlist.
And thank you, Whit. The last 2 points that we would like to make in opposition to this particular bill is that the bill also puts in jeopardy millions of dollars in federal funds, specifically that 60% federal match, what equates to in fiscal year 24, $368 million by not complying with the federal law.
Please hurry, your time.
And the last point is the final rule setting is nothing new. This has been around since January of 2014. We have known for the last 11 years that we must comply with the compliance deadline of March of 2023. So the time is now. Thank you.
Okay, and we have your written testimony as well, so thank you. Christine Osterlin with Deputy Secretary of Agency Integration. Welcome to committee.
Good morning, members of the committee. I'm Christine Osterlund, Deputy Secretary of Agency Integration and the State Medicaid Director. You have my testimony in front of you. I'll just highlight a few key points. First, I do want to address a proponent's comments about continuous eligibility being implemented in Kansas in 2022. That is factually incorrect. Continuous eligibility for adults in Kansas was implemented in 2010. It is a long-standing policy. It was put into a standalone 1115 waiver in 2022 as a part of Kansas moving managed care away from the 1115 waiver to a 1915B waiver. It came down to where you have to do federal authorities, but it was not a new policy. Another point that I'll make is in December 16th of 2024, I received a letter from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services very directly pointing out that KDHE maintains and owns ultimate responsibility for compliance with all Medicaid rules and regulations that come from the federal government. This letter specifically mentioned the conflict of interest provision around some of our targeted case management, and that letter did reference that if Kansas does not continue to make strides to mitigate our noncompliance with conflict of interest, we will lose federal funding, which you heard the last conferee spoke of how much money that is. Just another thing that I'll point out is this bill goes way beyond just some of the concerns you heard today around HCBS waivers. This goes to all facets of the Medicaid program. To give you an example of how things work in Medicaid, yesterday at 2:30 p.m. I received an email from CMS creating a mandatory change to the Medicaid program that I must submit a state plan amendment to CMS by March 31st, 3 weeks away. I have to do tribal consultations, I have to do a fiscal, I have to create a policy, and I have to draft and submit a state plan amendment. Failure to do so would put Kansas out of compliance with CMS and again risk federal funding. It is important to note, and in my testimony I outlined other just routine changes that happen in the Medicaid program. We don't always know when these mandates from CMS, like the one yesterday, we had no idea it was coming. It just shows up in our inbox with a very short time frame to implement. So again, just please be aware that this is a very complex program that does have very time-sensitive changes that we need to implement. Thank you.
Perfect, Christine, thank you. Laura Howard, Secretary of Kansas Department of Aging and Disability. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Laura Howard, Secretary for KDADS. I would echo the points that Deputy Secretary Osterlund just made, but I want to focus my testimony on the issue of the provisions added related to the HCBS program. My biggest concern is that these provisions jeopardize our ability to move forward timely with the new community support waiver. As you've heard from other conferees, there's already extensive oversight through the Bethel Oversight Committee, whose whole focus is around the CanCare program, select committees that have been in place. But the amendment that has been added really puts timely approval of the community supports waiver at risk by restricting our ability to comply with some of the federal Medicaid requirements that the state is currently out of compliance with and has been out of compliance with for a number of years. Areas like conflict-free case management, areas like unbundling of day services. You know, the community support waiver is a tool that this legislature has asked us to move forward with to address the issue of the waiting list. In addition to funding that you provided to reduce the comprehensive waivers waiting list, this is a new waiver that would allow us to make significant progress. On the second page of my testimony, I just wanted to point out Deputy Secretary Osterlund talked about the fact that we received a letter from CMS that reiterated that we needed to come in compliance with our corrective action plan for those items or risk loss of federal funds. But I wanted to point out the Code of Federal Regulation on the second page would also state in the 6I that any new waiver request has to provide assurance of compliance with the requirements of the final settings. So those things around those things around unbundling day service Services conflict of interest. Well, we've been allowed to have a transition plan for our existing waiver and to have a longer period of time to come into compliance. We cannot submit the community support waiver, which we're slated to submit later this year, without coming into compliance with those provisions. The letter's clear, the federal regulations are clear. So again, thank you for the chance to testify.
Thank you very much, Laura. Appreciate it. Next is Mike Burgess, Director of Policy Outreach at Disability Rights Center, Kansas. Welcome to committee, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'm Mike Burgess, the Director of Policy and Outreach at the Disability Rights Center in Kansas, and I love being towards the end because I can say a lot of ditto, and I agree with all the issues that the opponents have raised. So just for those of you that aren't aware, I was in the House for 10 years. I've been around. I was a CIO for a state agency briefly. Like, I've been passionate about process improvements and looking at how we can optimize systems. And if you look at any major project or program that we have changed going back decades, there's always room for improvement. And I think with that there are opportunities for improvement. This bill is not one of those things. It's not going to improve the process. It's not going to help speed things up. It's going to get in the way and erect barriers. And I think if we do want to move and have positive, important discussion around opportunities for process improvement, we would be at the table early and often. And I think most of the partners around here recognize that we just want to see things work and work for people with disabilities. And so we would love to have those conversations. But again, I want to urge you to oppose this particular piece. While some of the conversations that have happened are good, I think the legislation is definitely a bridge too far. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Very good. And now is the appropriate time. Committee, questions for the opponents?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll ask Sarah if that's okay. Maybe I should have asked this of the proponents, but I know you're very familiar with the IDD community and the work that you do in your field. Can you talk to us a little bit about the impact as far as wait list? What the impact this bill would have when we're talking about, I mean, obviously it's a topic we've discussed here over and over, trying to eliminate the wait list and reduce it. Can you expound upon, in practical terms, what that would look like?
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator. So as we've been working throughout last legislative session and this legislative session as well, we've really had kind of a two-step process toward eliminating the massive IDD wait list that we have here in Kansas. Kansas is historically one of the worst states in the country to have a wait list of this magnitude. WIT said 4,300 waiting individuals waiting 8 to 10 years to get those services. So our efforts have really been to chip away and work with you all to allocate additional slots. And as you all know, the House has funded this session 320 new slots, 320 new Kansans with IDD to receive services. And as we continue to work with our state agency partners on the comprehensive IDD waiver wait list, we have been working toward standing up our community supports waiver, which essentially is a waiver light specifically for individuals with IDD to receive services that allow them to either remain in their homes with their families and receive services in their communities. As Secretary Howard pointed out, due to federal regulations, we will not be able to start the community supports waiver in the state of Kansas until we get off our corrective action plan with CMS, that letter we received and many of us referenced in December. And so in order for us to move and march kind of in those two lanes, if you will, to tackle this crisis in Kansas, we need to move forward on adopting some of these changes that need to happen around conflict of interest and modernizing our system here in Kansas. So I hope that answers your question, Senator.
Thank you. Any further questions for any of the opponents? Excuse me. Senator Shane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Be happy to have any of the opponents answer this. It seems to me that there's been a picture painted of a pretty volatile environment with constant changing And that comes from both the proponents and the opponents. I guess I'm wondering, it seems that regardless of who's in the White House or regardless of what party is in charge, that volatility creates inherent harm. I guess what's the harm in having the legislature have the back of the agencies and verifying that we want to go along with what is being mandated from the federal level?
Christine Osterlin again. Yeah, there are a lot of changes that happen federally regardless of who is in the White House. I would say sometimes some administrations more so than others. I think where the challenge comes in is the timeliness of it. CMS, just like in the example I gave earlier, when these changes come down, there are times that, yes, we get time to implement and come into compliance. And then there are times, and generally, to be frank, they're when CMS gets behind. They get something issued late, but they don't extend the timeline for the states. They send an email and say in 3 weeks, you need to be in compliance, basically drop everything and do this. The point is, though, you don't have a choice as a state. So again, I wouldn't mind, sharing information with the legislature of like, these are all the CMS mandated changes that we got in a particular period. The problem is there is no choice. And if we say to CMS, well, we're just not going to do this, then basically they can say to us, then we're going to withhold federal funding for that portion of the program, whatever that may be, HCBS, it could be in medical services, wherever. So they really have the trump card. They dictate timelines, they dictate activities. Our role is to comply if we want to receive federal match.
Yeah, I guess I would see it in the interest of all Kansas taxpayers and of the agency that you help oversee that this is an unsustainable and unethical cycle that we sit in, that the federal government would be creating such mandates and then creating that fear of loss of funding for noncompliance under unreasonable, in an unreasonable situation. So I guess I'm wondering out loud, right? I think there's maybe inherent value to trying to stop the bleeding, so to speak, of this what seems to be very volatile and unsustainable way of governing coming down from the federal government and tying that to federal spending authority. So thank you very much for your testimony today.
Further questions? Ms. Olsher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Christine, come back, please. I appreciate you clarifying information that was presented earlier in terms of low-income parents and the timing of the policy. Can you talk a little bit to, we keep hearing that phrase, able-bodied. Can you help us understand what, more about that designation pertinent to this legislation?
So, again, just kind of talking about who this population is. So they could be somebody that has a disability. The difference is, to be considered disabled in the Medicaid space, you must meet the Social Security definition of disabled, which is a very stringent requirement. And the reason for that is if you're declared disabled by the Social Security Administration, you receive disability checks. So again, to make the assumption that everybody in that parent and caretaker program is able-bodied would not be accurate. Some of them will have disabilities, medical conditions, other things that may prohibit them from working or working full-time. The other thing I will say about that, the population, and the Kansas Health Institute, comes out with statistics every year. We know that 70%, it always ranges between 68 and 72% of that population actually do work. It's just, again, they are extremely low income, as you heard Ms. Brom testify, because our threshold is 39% of the federal poverty level. And so it means if you're a parent with a couple children, you're making $12,000 roughly a year. That would be, that's just an impossible income level. So again, some of these folks are working. We know many of them are. They may be working part-time because they have other health conditions. So again, I think able-bodied is a broad stroke brush for a much deeper explanation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. I call your attention, there's 5 more written-only opposition. As I look at this and listen to this, one thing kind of comes to mind to me is lots of times we hear about local control. And we seem to be giving it to Washington all the time, or they give it to Topeka. And I think these are sorts of things. I think that's part of our responsibility here is try to kind of sort some of that out. Bob Bethel's been mentioned. They do oversight, but that's it. You know, it's like a babysitter who oversees your children who maybe might run out in the street. But somebody needs to stop it too. So these are sorts of things that sort of come to mind with me. So we appreciate everybody here. And any further comments before we close? We'll close the hearing on 2240 in committee. Our business is done. We're dismissed.